Gerd is our expert on Qatar and the GCC, and I have been fortunate to teach classes on Middle East politics and have dabbled a little in Middle East politics. So for many of you, this will be things you already know. We thought what we would do is to start with a broad overview of some of the major developments occurring in the region, and then come to our own neck of the woods here in the Gulf, talk about the GCC and implications of what's happening for Qatar, which I'm sure most of you are interested in knowing. So Gerd and I will each talk for about 15 minutes. Hopefully this will leave ample time for questions and answers, and we will then have a discussion afterwards. In terms of the regional developments and what is happening in the region, I think the best way or the best place to start is with Syria, which is one of the four main countries that I want to focus on: Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. And then, as I mentioned, Qatar will talk about the GCC. Gerd will talk about Qatar and the GCC. When we look at Syria, we see that Syria is one of those prime cases emerging out of the 2011 uprisings in which one key development did not happen. A key development that occurred in places like Egypt and Tunisia, which was the decisive factor in the outcome of the uprisings, namely the abandonment of the leadership by the armed forces. And that was really the key determining factor in influencing the outcome of what happened in 2011. So in Tunisia and Egypt, when the armed forces abandoned ostensibly civilian leaders, you had a transition of power. In places where the military didn't abandon the leadership, the civilian leadership, or where the military was fractured itself, you had different outcomes. Those outcomes were mostly in the form of civil wars. And we see that in places like Syria, Yemen, and although for somewhat different reasons, we see that also in Libya. The fracture of the post-revolutionary or post-uprising political system in these cases resulted in civil wars. And civil wars, of course, facilitated and were also brought on by weak states. So after 2011, we have a proliferation of weak states, collapsed countries, in other words, in which external actors found an opportunity to become involved and try and enhance their own influence, deepen their own influence. Syria was one of those cases. Ostensibly, what happened in Syria was that the top leadership, top command of the armed forces stayed with the civilian leadership. The defections that did occur in the Syrian armed forces were by rank and file, most of whom were not Alawis, were not from the same confession as the political leadership. And so Syria degenerated into a tragic and bloody civil war. That afforded the opportunity for a number of external actors to step into Syria in the same way that they had stepped into Libya and then later in Yemen to try and expand their influence. Those actors included Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then later on Russia and Turkey. But before long, by the time we come into 2013, late 2012, 2013, Syria has become a battlefield for external actors, either directly, such as Iran and Russia, or through external proxies, such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, trying to influence events. And what we have had is a stalemate in Syria, in which now the fate of Syria is being decided by non-Syrians. You might know that the Geneva talks yet again are about to occur, primarily under the auspices of everybody saying it's under the auspices of the United Nations, but really through the under the auspices of Russia. And the main actors in the Syrian theater have become Iran, Russia, and Turkey. and conspicuously absent is a Syrian voice. In fact, the Syrians themselves are notoriously divided, and they're not getting anywhere. Also, you might argue that defeated, or at least seriously set back, are Saudi efforts to influence events, the course of events in Syria. Before I talk about Saudi Arabia, let me say a couple of things about Iran. Iran, of course, was one of those countries that had its own spring, not in 2011, but in 2009, in which the government brutally repressed. That was the re-election of former President Ahmadinejad in 2009, where the election results were perceived to have been stolen, and there was a social movement which was brutally repressed. So when 2011 came around, as a result of the brutal repression of 2009, there was no social movement in Iran in 2011. There was no Iranian spring of any sort in 2011. So the Iranian regime emerged strong, and in fact in 2013 it elected a reformist, moderate president, the President Rouhani, whose campaign slogans have been moderation. It is his actual campaign slogan. Like all other countries, Iran's self-interest drove it to be involved in Syria, and those self-interests dictated that Iran prop up the existing Syrian regime. And so Iran, Russia became involved on the side of the Syrians at the same time as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and initially Turkey were trying to foster the collapse of the Syrian regime. Now, as a result of 2011, due to heightened tensions, and because 2011 and the consequences of 2011 became so personally unstable, personally difficult and uneasy for individuals to stomach, at a very personal level, primordial sentiments became pervasive across the Middle East. Not just in the Middle East, but particularly in the Gulf region. And after 2011, we have the spread like wildfire of sectarian sensibilities, sensibilities which resulted in tensions. This sectarianism was fed on the one hand by state actors, namely in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that tried to frame popular uprisings in a sectarian framing, and on the other hand by popular sentiments. For example, here in Qatar, if in 2012, if you went to any of the local mosques, most likely you would hear highly sectarian sermons on Fridays against the Shia and against others. Iran is by no means immune. It's the large dominant Shia power, and Iran's activities in Syria were both animated and motivated by, and were also perceived as having been driven by sectarian sensibilities and sentiments. So Iran's involvement in Syria only fed into a sectarian narrative that we're all contending with, particularly here. And that only added to Iran's diplomatic and strategic competition with Saudi Arabia. The strategic competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because of Iran's involvement in Syria, because of Iran's action, assumed an additional sectarian dimension that did not have in the 1980s and the 1990s, when Iran and Saudi Arabia also competed strategically, also tried to undermine. So the new competition is slightly different. So I can talk more about internal domestic politics in Iran. I can talk ad nauseum about Iran because it happens to be a subject of my interest, but I won't go into too much detail. Suffice it to say that Iran's intervention and proactive involvement in Syria on the part of the regime only fed into and reinforced a sectarian narrative that had previously been framed by the Bahraini government and the Saudi government, and Iran also only really reinforced and added fuel to the sectarian fire through its own activities and initiatives. Then, of course, we have the country next to Syria, which has always been on the verge of implosion. In fact, I'm talking about Lebanon. In fact, Lebanon's political system is so inherently, innately fragile, and the arrangements on which the political system is based are so artificial that the country is susceptible to the slightest pressure from within or from the outside. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, the latest official census in Lebanon is from 1933, according to which, if I'm not mistaken, according to which, at that time, the Christians were a majority, followed by the Sunnis, then the Shia, and finally the Druze. And ever since then, ever since independence, Lebanon's political system has had, as a result, a Christian president, a Sunni prime minister, a Shia speaker of parliament, and a high-ranking member of cabinet that has been Druze. So you can imagine over time, with demographic changes, demographic shifts, the demographic balance has shifted, but the official power balance has not shifted. And when in 1971, after 1971, when Lebanon was subject to the pressure of incoming Palestinians that were kicked out of Jordan as a result of the Jordanian Civil War, also known as Black September, in relatively short order, in about 4 years, Lebanon erupted into civil war because those very fragile artificial arrangements on which the political system was based were subject to strain and pressure, and everything collapsed and broke up into a civil war. In 1991, the civil war finally ended, and Syria, which was the dominant power, eventually left the country in 2005. But the fragility of the Lebanese political system and the weakness of central authority in Lebanon continued. And that weakness had also given birth, due to Iranian machinations, to an armed group, namely the Hezbollah, which the Iranians have historically employed as a deterrent to Israel. And I think it's very important to remember a couple of things when we talk about Hezbollah. First and foremost, Hezbollah is a Lebanese entity. It is a Lebanese organization. It is a political group that is also armed, but it is also a political group that has engaged in an awful lot of civil society activities. They run clinics, they run schools, they run daycare, they take care of orphans, and in many instances, the Lebanese Hezbollah is the only viable institution in the southern parts of the country where the reaches of the central government are most tenuous. The Hezbollah is also an close Iranian ally. It has its own agency. It has its own decision-making. It has its own autonomy. But it is also closely allied with Iran. It isn't a stooge of Iran, but it is a close ally of Iran, and it is an armed actor in the Lebanese political arena. And this influence of the Hezbollah has been a point of contention, A, for Israel, which Hezbollah being the only Arab army to have ever defeated Israel in an armed conflict. It inflicted serious casualties on Israel, and lately for Saudi Arabia, because it is pro-Iranian and Hezbollah has been actively involved in propping up the Syrian regime. So you can see how Saudi Arabia has wanted to undermine Hezbollah, to undermine Iran as well. Let me end with a couple of notes on Saudi Arabia and what is happening in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has, as we all know, since 2013, adopted a radically different foreign and domestic policy as compared to any time in its history since 2013. And that is because of the ascendance of new political actors in the Saudi system. Those new political actors include namely the king, Salman, and his son, Mohammed bin Salman. And they have instituted a series of fundamentally radical foreign policy initiatives and domestic policy initiatives, both in terms of the political arena and in Saudi economy. When we look at Saudi diplomacy since 2013, we see that repeatedly Saudi Arabia's diplomatic and foreign policy initiatives have hit a roadblock. The war in Yemen was supposed to be a 2-month endeavor, and it still continues 2 years on with no end in sight. The blockade of Qatar was supposed to be a 2-week endeavor, and it still continues with Qatar in no mood to settle. The competition with Iran has not gotten anywhere. Saudi efforts in Syria have reached a deadlock, and Saudi Arabia is now trying to organize its own opposition, Syrian opposition, and it hasn't gotten anywhere. And the forcible resignation of the Prime Minister of Lebanon seems to have backfired in Saudi Arabia. So when we look at Mohammed bin Salman and company's diplomatic initiatives, we see really a series of failures. Whether in Riyadh they see that or not is a different story. But we see a very different set of dynamics at work domestically. What Mohammed bin Salman is doing is to institute a series of fundamental and important reforms in Saudi domestic politics. And he has decided that he needs to do 2 things. He first needs the support of the population. So he has at the same time instituted a series of highly popular social reforms. Women can drive. There are now music concerts in Saudi Arabia. People have more social freedom. They don't get harassed by the religious police as much in the street. And you know what? For the average person in Riyadh and in Jeddah and elsewhere, that's what matters. The treatment on a day-to-day basis, that's what is important. The second thing that Mohammed bin Salman has decided is that if his domestic reforms, political and economic, have any chance of success, he needs to dismantle the deep state. He needs to get rid of all these princes that occupy positions of prominence, that are incredibly wealthy, and who can undermine his domestic political agenda. And what he has done in dramatic fashion, he has sought to dismantle the state. At one genius stroke, I think, he has not only gotten rid of the opposition, but he has now held them hostage for billions of dollars. You can literally buy your way out of the prison, which is the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. And so the estimates are, according to Saudi Arabia itself, that $100 billion can be collected from the people who have now been incarcerated. And so the jury is out on that. My gut tells me that he's going to succeed. And I'll tell you why. Because there's a parallel to what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And that parallel occurred here in Qatar. Not necessarily holding of other royals as hostage, but Sheikh Hamad, when he came to power, he did not, in 1995, did not have the support of the older Al Thanis. In fact, he came to power despite the older Al Thanis. And what did he do? He went directly to people. He promised a series of reforms and very important initiatives that made him incredibly popular. And that popularity continues until today. So my gut tells me that Mohammed bin Salman's deep popularity among the Saudi youth is going to carry the day domestically. Internationally is a different case. And now we turn to Gerd for regional developments.
Thanks, Mehran. And let me pick up on the Saudi point of view and show that there's always room for debate. And Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman particularly are worth focusing on, because ultimately, you know, he personally, and Saudi Arabia by extension, is the key actor in all of this. That's not to say that some of the initiatives to do with Qatar really came from Mohammed bin Salman. That was at least as much inspired by another Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. As you know, I'll come back to Mohammed bin Salman in a second. As you know, the United Arab Emirates, although some people I gather have been confused about this, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, is not a unitary state. It's a federation of 7 sheikdoms. And the ones that really count in terms of foreign policy have always been Dubai, which is, I suppose, for many years been the most famous internationally, and Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi is where most of the oil is located, and where the biggest sovereign wealth funds are. Dubai has had for a long time had the biggest international presence, and of course, brand Dubai is all about international trade, a hub for services, and so on. Those two are ruled by separate royal families, ruling families. The Al Maktoum in Dubai, with Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid as its current leader, and Al Nahyan in Abu Dhabi. They have quite a diverse history. The Al Maktoums, like a few other players in the Gulf region, have always been outward-oriented, trade-oriented, maritime orientation, whereas the Bani Yas of Abu Dhabi were always more land-based. So they come from a different outlook. The Bani Yas in some ways were more parochial. They used to, of which the Al Nahyan are the leading family. They were engaged in all sorts of regional skirmishes in their immediate surroundings. The Maktoums of Dubai were more interested in trade. And so when the UAE was formed, you know, when they were, for many years, while they accepted a common draft constitution and they accepted a common president who became almost naturally the leader, the Amir, or the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Zayed, they retained lots of diversity within, including even separate armed forces for many emirates until very recently. Now everything's been merged. But as the UAE developed, Dubai retained its autonomy in many ways, including internationally. They would conclude its own arms deals and so on and so on. And its brand was quite different from Abu Dhabi. The Al Maktoum for a long time also had very good relations with Al Thani, or parts of the Al Thani in Qatar. And were generally very, very pragmatic, just as Al Thani foreign policy under Sheikh Hamad became. So that diversity kept some kind of balance within the UAE. And in fact, while Abu Dhabi was far richer and became far richer especially, it was also in Abu Dhabi's interests to maintain the Dubai brand that fed into the UAE's overall interests. But that's that's shifted. And two things really made it shift. Because as you know, Mohammed bin Zayed was really the main instigator of the level of vitriol being spouted at Qatar. So what made this possible? What made possible the Gulf crisis, the cutting off, the incredibly harsh boycott, going for shock and awe right from the first night, and then realizing you can't quite make it effective. That's not the kind of thing that would have been in Dubai's interest or in the Al Maktoum's interest, and not the kind of thing anybody would have expected before. There'd been all sorts of tensions, of course, friction over the various roles of the different states in the GCC, over what the direction of the GCC should be, over where the headquarters of the United GCC Central Bank should be, and so on and so on. But never anything like this kind of cutting off of social relations, kinship relations, buckets of vitriol being thrown at other ruling families. Apparent instigation of, attempts at regime change in Qatar, and so on. That was a novelty. So this was really in part a result of two shifts in the UAE. One was that as time went on, well, first of all, Sheikh Zayed, the old charismatic leader who was behind the creation of the UAE and led Abu Dhabi for so many years, died, right? And then his son, Mohammed bin Zayed, took over. Different kind of personality, sharp, incredibly ambitious, incredibly bad at listening at other opinions. And throughout his career, his youth, and then his education and career, shaped by and through the military and the security establishment. That is his main interest. So that was one thing, but it took time for him to build up the confidence and support and so on and experience. So that's one thing that had been happening. And then, of course, you had the financial crisis in 98, where Dubai suffered grievously. It had been very ambitious in its investment strategies. It had leveraged its resources, its real estate investments and so on. Huge debts were underlying. This was kind of a bit of a bubble, both for the government and government entities that had been investing and borrowing, and for the broader economic sector in Dubai. So they ended up going virtually bankrupt if it hadn't been for about $20 billion worth of support from Abu Dhabi. So the power relationship shifted. And so what we now have, regardless of the old pragmatism of the Al Maktoum and the popularity of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid in Dubai and the old relations between the Maktoums and the Al Thani, foreign policy essentially is determined now by Abu Dhabi. Now, there is something that is perhaps in common with the situation in Saudi Arabia, where decision-making has also changed. As Mehran was saying, there's been a shift in king and then a generational shift, because before Mohammed bin Salman even was made crown prince, they'd already shifted away from the old system of rulership and succession in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the latest version of Saudi Arabia was created in early 1930s by Abdul Aziz, also known as Ibn Saud. And all of the kings after that were his sons. They kind of moved in a downward age range. They took over as king until King Abdullah, king previous to the current one, he'd still been a direct son of the founder of Saudi Arabia. And as that transition continued, all of those sons, and there were about 44 of them, there's different estimates, but many of them were, as Mehran had been saying, at the commanding heights of politics and the economy. And over time, they were not just ministers and in charge of key institutions, they built up real fiefdoms. So there were two consequences of that, one negative and one perhaps less negative. The negative one is, as perhaps you were also hinting at, almost any attempts at reform, and clearly over time reform became more and more necessary, economic reform, was stymied when they were supposed to be system-wide by all these silos. And that was reinforced by the interests that these princes built up and the corruption that went along with it. So that was one of the things clearly that Mohammed bin Salman wanted to break through once and for all. Even after the generations of those princes was beginning to shift, King Salman is still a son of Abdul Aziz. But under Abdullah and King Salman, other princes of the following generation began to be moved in positions of influence. So Mohammed bin Nayef, the nephew of Salman and Abdullah, who was the son of the previous senior prince, Prince Nayef, the Minister of Interior for decades. Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the deputy in Ministry of Interior, was then made Minister of Interior and then was made Crown Prince. So people said, aha, finally we're getting the second generation in. What happened not long after Salman became king, and Salman, who had been always very respected and was in in charge of all the secrets of the family, really. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew where corruption had happened. He was the family jailer for many years. He was the family source of family discipline within the Al Saud. But by the time he became king, he was he'd been very much weakened. His health is in trouble. It's fairly clear that he has some mental deterioration, which has been going on for quite some time. And he wasn't really spending, and certainly now isn't spending much time at all governing every day. Perhaps an hour a day or so he'll concentrate. Some days are better than others. So this allowed Mohammed bin Salman to reinforce his position to be reinforced. He's long been the favorite young son of Salman. And the way the Saudi system worked was there was always this reverence for seniority, and especially for the person who was selected king. Even if there were questions about whether, some people might think, well, there's this or that with the king, or I think it should be the other brother. Nevertheless, once king gave you huge authority, nobody's been really willing to go against decisions of the king traditionally. So the fact that he is king, even if he isn't ruling much of the time, gave Mohammed bin Salman huge scope for expanding his power, for taking decisions that otherwise he'd never been able to do. One of the things he did was to move away that recently appointed crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, who'd been long in charge of the security system and intelligence, and very effective collaborator with the United States intelligence services. He moved them aside, put him under house arrest quite some time ago now, so that was a first precursor of the events that we saw in recent, this past month and weeks. And then when he felt confident enough, he just went the whole way, in a way that really surprised everybody, including all the princes, which is why, of course, they didn't flee when they had the chance. So the reason I wanted to spend a little time on that, as with the case of decision-making in Abu Dhabi, or the UAE, is that the fact that these two individuals, with their particular proclivities, and their now incredibly narrowed circle of decision-making and advice even, that they are now in the position that they are, that, to my mind, explains a lot about the kinds of decisions that have been taken. On the one hand, as Mehran said, the domestic reform of both economy and political system, something like this needed to happen, and you had to be fairly drastic. And so in that sense, you could see why he wanted to move. You needed somebody with that kind of drive to go for it. On the other hand, in foreign policy, it's brought exactly the kinds of failures that Mehran's pointed to. Decisions have been made very impetuously, without serious consideration of alternatives, without any feedback from the kinds of folks that might have been around otherwise. Because one of the positives of the old Saudi system was you always had a variety of voices. Some of it was about fiefdoms and corruption and all that kind of stuff. But when it came to foreign policy and even other decisions, policy might be slow in emerging, but it was carefully calibrated, and all kinds of possible consequences and pros and cons were debated. That's gone. It's gone. Decisions at Mohammed bin Salman's court, protected by the notional presence of King Salman, are taken by his little court, his courtiers. He will listen to consultants, but not about politics or international affairs. Consultants like McKinsey and so on. But beyond that, there's nobody who dares talk against what Mohammed bin Salman has decided. So it leads to a number of initially plausible options being pursued that, if any more thought had been given to it, any more experience has been brought to bear on it, would probably not have been taken in the way they were. The attempt at virtually kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister is a perfect example. How anyone could seriously have expected this to have been taken as at face value, that he really wanted to resign the day after he was in perfectly good spirits with his government, a day before all sorts of meetings were going to take place with other regional players, with clear agenda points, and so on and so on and so on. I can only explain that by the sense of impetuousness and arrogance and the lack of any sort of sounding boards being used. So anyway, there we are. One little point on where I diverge a little with Mehran is the internal situation in Saudi Arabia. It's absolutely right, I think, although of course it's very hard to get scientifically sound evidence of the public opinion in Saudi Arabia, but it's anecdotal evidence does seem to indicate that the economic reforms, that the anti-corruption campaign or narrative is popular, particularly amongst the young in Saudi Arabia. The concern, of course, that I have about Saudi Arabia is that any voices, when it's not about culture or the economic reform agenda as stated by Mohammed bin Salman, any voice that says anything else about anything else or that goes counter to even any aspect of these reforms, let alone about foreign policy, has been ruled out. So while there's been a social and a cultural opening up, and while there's been a promise of economic liberalization of sorts, but that hasn't actually happened yet, politically, there's been a draconian limiting of room for maneuver, draconian closing down of political space, which is why many of the people that have been arrested or that have decided they needed to exile themselves to avoid being arrested are not just the old corrupt old guard, whether private or royal, but include reformers of all stripes, from moderately Islamist to secular. So that tells you another part of the story. And my worry about it is that key to his reforms will be not just social freedoms, it will be jobs. That's one of the key pressure points for the Saudi economy in the next 5 to 10 years. There's already huge unemployment. And that's what's in part driving some of the unrest has been at various times. The key to create jobs is in fact a reform plan, but that presupposes two things in addition to education. One is confidence and willingness to invest hundreds of billions of dollars on the part of the domestic private sector, and two, confidence and willingness to invest hundreds of billions of dollars by the foreign potential investors. And both, I think, have been put in question by the way in which she's gone about the political reforms, by the uncertainty, the extra legality without any kind of predictability. And already one sees some effects of that in the Saudi stock exchange and in decisions that are being made by major companies. So if the jobs don't appear within the medium term, then I fear a lot of the resentments are going to bubble back up again, and there will be potential leaders available to take charge of that, both amongst the Al Saud and the rest of the elites.
Thank you. Quickly, can you tell us what this means for Qatar and the blockade in like
Sure.
2 minutes,
2 minutes
before we open it up? Very quickly.
Okay, so at the surface you might think if the defining characteristic of Mohammed bin Salman's rule is unpredictability and impetuousness, then that might give cause for concern for Qatar. But I think we've actually had the worst of that already. The way in which the blockade was announced, the fact that they went 100% of what they had from the start, given that military intervention wasn't ultimately really an option, given international positions, showed that this decision, to my mind, was taken in a way that was not well thought through, and they've really got nowhere else to go at the minute. So in that sense, there's the impact of everything we've said isn't direct. But I think there are two ways that are concerning. I'll start by saying that I think most of the fundamentals of the Qatari economy and its interests are in fact fine now, in the sense that imports and exports are booming, imports have recovered, logistics, supply lines are back in place, and that's only going to improve over the next few months. The impact of the withdrawal of finance by GCC, by Saudi, Bahraini, Egyptian, and UAE investors in the banking system and otherwise, a lot of that was withdrawn, several tens of billions worth, but that was a one-off. You can't keep withdrawing it. Once it's withdrawn, it's withdrawn. So, and the Qatari, the government, through the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the central bank, had enough funds to start replenishing this to ensure confidence. The worry could be the money that's being spent, or that had to be spent, and certainly in the first 4 months a lot was spent on maintaining the dollar peg of the Qatari rial. And theoretically that could be open-ended. It's really a question of the psychology of the markets. If the markets think that the fundamentals are okay, there's not going to be an invasion, the Qataris can sustain this for the medium-term future, then it will not be too much pressure on the rial, on the dollar peg, and so the government doesn't have to spend too much. But that's really a key question where damage could be inflicted. The other one that I worry about is to do with Iran. If these regional interventions, so for instance, if Emmanuel Macron hadn't intervened and sorted out the Hariri business by giving him a way out, and the Saudis' inability to stop him to leave to Paris, and then, if the original Saudi plan had worked of taking away Hariri as the kind of fig leaf for Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon, it might have led to an armed conflict of sorts. Would that have brought conflict that drew in Iran? If that happened, might there have been some kind of reaction in which the Udeid base in Qatar got involved? Then what was Iran going to do? These sorts of things would bring Qatar into a very difficult spot. On balance, I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway.
Perfect. Thank you.